Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're uncovering the fascinating and, honestly, often completely misunderstood history of how the modern Indian caste system was heavily shaped and solidified by British colonial administration. This is an explainer that will fundamentally change how you view one of the world's most complex social structures. We're going to look closely at the historical records, the colonial literature, and the very specific, calculated administrative decisions that helped mold caste into the rigid system we recognize today. So let's kick things off with a question that kind of challenges everything most of us think we know about Indian history. Is the rigid, highly codified caste system truly ancient, stretching back perfectly intact to Vedic times? Or is it largely a colonial invention? Well, the answer, as we're about to see, is heavily weighted toward the latter. When the British first arrived, they encountered a diverse, localized, and incredibly dynamic society. But that didn't fit neatly onto a bureaucratic spreadsheet or into a colonial legal framework.
Section 1. The myth of static caste.
To really understand this, we have to start by looking at how the British interpreted Indian society through a deeply flawed lens, essentially creating this myth of a static India. And the most crucial point here, the word caste itself isn't even indigenous to India. There's actually no exclusive local term that perfectly corresponds to it. The word we use today entered the English vocabulary from Portuguese and Spanish travelers back in the mid-15th century. They used the word castas, meaning pure or chaste, to describe the purity of blood or racial purity of the ranked groupings they observed on the Malabar coast. So right from the jump, a completely European concept of racial purity was pasted onto a complex Indian social reality. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive disconnect. The British relied on translated ancient texts to see this neat, rigid four-tier Varna hierarchy: Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. But in doing so, they completely ignored the complex, localized jati reality that people were actually living day to day. The Varna model gave them a beautifully neat but utterly distorted image of the caste system. It looked like a closed, top-down hierarchy. But on the ground, the real operational units were jatis. Jatis were far more dynamic. They represented contested hierarchies, fluid occupational classifications, and localized identities that shifted over time. The colonial rulers, however, were desperately looking for a master key to understand all of India, and they thought they found it in that rigid textual Varna model.
Section 2. Translating texts, creating hierarchies.
Let's look at how this misunderstanding was systematically built into a new reality. Early colonialists didn't just passively observe, they actively curated the knowledge they collected. When early surveyors like Colin Mackenzie, who was the first Surveyor General of India, went out to gather knowledge, they relied almost entirely on high-caste Brahmin assistants. Mackenzie was absolutely obsessed with mapping and collecting local histories, but his data collection process was anything but neutral. Whenever his agents went to a new town, they sought out books by first looking for learned Brahmins. This meant the reality they documented for the British Empire was heavily skewed from a top-down, scriptural Brahminic perspective. They basically assumed the only knowledge worth having was mediated through this very specific elite lens.
Section 3. Divide, rule, and measure.
But here's the thing. Simply translating ancient texts wasn't enough. A massive political shock forced the British to fundamentally change their administrative strategy from merely studying texts to fiercely measuring the people on the ground. Tracing this timeline, we can really see this major shift. In 1794, William Jones translated the Laws of Manu, which cemented that ancient textual Varna model in the minds of British administrators. But then came 1857. The mutiny was a rude awakening. During this widespread agrarian revolt, high-caste soldiers united against the British. The colonial government suddenly realized they had a massive blind spot. They urgently needed on-the-ground ethnographic data to prevent future uprisings, which ultimately culminated in huge administrative efforts, like H. Risley's 1901 Census of India.
Take a second to think about Lord Elphinstone's chillingly clear declaration right after the 1857 mutiny. The security of the British Empire now explicitly rested on actively maintaining the divisions within Indian society, divide and rule. The army was quickly reorganized so that regiments were composed of different isolated caste groups. They saw that Indians uniting was the ultimate threat, and caste emerged as the perfect, convenient cultural instrument to keep them divided.
Imagine being a colonial administrator panicking over a united India. Suddenly, documenting and magnifying religious and caste differences became your absolute ultimate tool for political survival. The British were introducing caste-free occupations, a uniform judicial system, and modern institutions. But paradoxically, they were terrified these very reforms might foster a united spirit of nationhood.
So, to counter this, they heavily leaned into categorizing, separating, and emphasizing the distinctness of every single caste and subcaste they could possibly identify.
Section 4. Inventing Race and Criminality.
This desperate need to categorize and divide people led directly into one of the darkest chapters of colonial administration, pseudoscientific ethnography. Now, initially, scholars like Nesfield classified castes logically, simply by occupation or function. He grouped them into categories like those connected with land, artisans, traders, servers, priests, and religious groups. Nesfield importantly suggested that all castes actually had a unitary origin. In his view, the divisions between them were just a functional necessity based on what they did for a living, kind of like medieval guilds in Europe.
But then, Census Commissioner H.H. Risley completely flips this functional approach. It wasn't enough to divide people by what they did. He began dividing them by who they biologically supposedly were. He introduced the utterly bizarre pseudoscience of anthropometry. He was literally measuring people's bodies and, incredibly, their noses. Risley theorized that caste was the outcome of two distinct racial groups clashing, a light-skinned Aryan type and a dark-skinned non-Aryan type. He claimed to establish a direct correlation between the average nasal index, which is the ratio between nasal length and breadth, and caste hierarchy. According to his deeply flawed science, the finer the nose, the higher the social rank. He used this to falsely claim that caste was an inescapable biological hierarchy based on racial purity, literally turning a social system into a racial one. This racial obsession led the British to invent broad, incredibly damaging stereotypes that literally dictated government policy. They labeled entire groups as martial races, like Dogras, Rajputs, and Gurkhas, stereotyping them as manly, independent, and loyal to authority, making them the primary recruits for the post-1857 Indian Army. On the flip side, they condemned groups that opposed British rule, such as the Kolars and Marwars of the Madras Presidency, as hereditary criminal castes. It is a stark, shocking example of how colonial loyalty or disloyalty was masked as innate biological and racial traits.
Section 5. The Colonial Legacy.
So how did these pseudoscientific measurements and divide-and-rule tactics permanently alter the fabric of India? What was the lasting impact of this massive bureaucratic exercise? Well, through the huge bureaucratic machinery of the decennial census, starting in 1872, and academic institutions systematically stamping these theories into official gazetteers, these incredibly fluid, complex social realities were forced into rigid, inescapable legal identities. Caste became the single term capable of organizing India's diverse forms of social identity. The British demanded to know your caste for tax assessment, for military recruitment, and for court proceedings. A classification designed by the colonial government was forced onto the natives, systematically overriding their own dynamic networks of identity.
Ironically, while British courts did remove some traditional inequalities, for example, passing the Widow Remarriage Act in 1856, or the Caste Disability Removal Act, their relentless documentation actually made caste more uniform, totalizing, and pervasive than it had ever been in pre-colonial history. By stripping traditional caste councils of their legal authority and replacing them with a British uniform judicial system, while simultaneously using caste as the primary demographic metric, the colonial rulers fundamentally refigured caste. It ceased to be an organic social relation, it became a rigid tool of statecraft.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. Now that we understand this rigid system was not just some ancient tradition, but was heavily constructed, categorized, and weaponized by colonial paperwork to divide and rule, what does it take to finally deconstruct it? If the very categories we use today were etched into stone by 19th century colonial bureaucrats obsessed with measuring noses to prevent uprisings, how do we move beyond them? It's a fascinating question, and one that absolutely reframes our entire understanding of modern history. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you a completely new perspective on the colonial history of caste.